Okay, how is that looking for everybody?
Good. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We are so grateful for you to take the time out of your schedule this afternoon. So today we have Nicole Gardner from the Alzheimer Society of Toronto. She is the public education coordinator, and she's going to be presenting to us today on FTD and ALS. And so we're going to hand it over to you. And then if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. You are all muted, so you don't have an opportunity to ask those questions. But if there's something you want in terms of the follow-up, we're happy to follow up with Nicole after the fact as well, and send any resources that people are asking for. And at the end of this, I'll come back on and we'll follow up if there's any other questions. Thank you so much, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Kim, and hello and welcome, everybody. I'm so happy to be here. And today we're doing a presentation about frontotemporal dementia and ALS. So again, my name is Nicole Gardner and I'm a public education coordinator at the Alzheimer Society of Toronto. And I know a little bit, or quite a bit, I guess, about dementia. So I'm here to kind of bring that lens and talk about frontotemporal dementia and how does it connect to ALS? Because it's often confusing, you know, you hear a lot of these terms go around, but what do they mean? How do they connect? We're going to talk about that today. So a little bit about myself. I've worked in this role for about 3 years. And prior to this role, I was working at an adult day program at the Alzheimer Society in Peel. And I supported people living with any form of dementia. So frontotemporal dementia, I see a lot of people with vascular dementia or Alzheimer's disease. So hopefully I will be able to share some stories with you today and answer any questions or comments that you might have as well. So let's get started here. So I first just want to see who we have in the room. So before I start, I just would like to ask a poll question, and it should show up on your screen. And it just says to tell us about yourself. So are you a person with ALS? Are you a person with FTD, or what we call frontotemporal dementia? Do you have a dual diagnosis of FTD and ALS? Or are you a family member of a friend of somebody who has frontotemporal dementia and or ALS? Are you a student, a healthcare professional, or other? I'm not sure if I'm able to see the results of the poll.
We can see the results of the poll, Nicole. 13% of people are living with ALS.
Okay.
0% person living with FTD. 0% have a dual diagnosis of FTD and ALS. 87% is a family member or friend of a person living with FTD or ALS, and 0% are healthcare professionals.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing that. So I just want to make sure everybody can see my screen again. You're able to see the slide deck. Hopefully, okay, perfect.
Yes, you can, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, this is my first time using this type of webinar platform, so I just want to make sure. All right, so here's what we're going to be talking about today. And again, thank you very much, everybody, for engaging in that poll question. I just wanted to get to know who the audience is a little bit. So hopefully today, even no matter what role you're coming from, no matter what perspective, I hope that you maybe take away 2 or 3 key things from this webinar. And again, hopefully I'll do my best to answer any questions or comments that you might have. So we're going to first define dementia. So what is it? What is dementia? We're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to name examples of irreversible forms of dementia, including what we call frontotemporal dementia. We're going to list symptoms that might occur with frontotemporal dementia, and then we're going to describe what is the connection between frontotemporal dementia and ALS, and then identify some strategies for supporting a person living with cognitive changes. And then also we're going to talk about some of the services that we have available at the Alzheimer Society in Toronto and how they might be supportive for yourself somebody that you know, a friend or family, etc. So another poll question I have here is, what is dementia? So again, we hear this term a lot, but what does it mean? So is it the first stage of memory problems? Is it a set of symptoms which include loss of memory, understanding, and judgment? Is it a mild form of Alzheimer's disease, or is it a severe form of Alzheimer's disease? Just take a second to vote.
We have 6% of the people responded to say first stage of memory problems which develops into Alzheimer's. 8% of people said set of symptoms including loss of memory and judgment. 0% said a mild form of Alzheimer's, and 6% said a severe form of Alzheimer's.
Okay, so we're kind of seeing a mixture here of how people are responding. Thank you so much, everybody, for participating in that. The correct answer is the second one there. So a set of symptoms which include loss of memory, understanding, and judgment. So if you don't mind just stopping the sharing of that poll, and I'll be able to share my screen again. Wonderful. So it's often confusing what the term dementia means. So dementia is an umbrella term that's used to describe a set of symptoms in an individual. So when somebody has dementia, we see symptoms like a decline in their memory, changes to the person's judgment, to their understanding, and other cognitive thinking abilities. But we can also see changes to somebody's mood, to their behavior, to their communication. So these symptoms, when somebody has a diagnosis of dementia, it means they're significant enough to affect the person's daily functioning and living. In everyday tasks, they're having difficulty now with everyday tasks due to the changes in their memory, their judgment, their understanding. So there can be many different causes to these symptoms, and one of those causes is Alzheimer's disease. So you probably heard of that several times, but there's many different causes to that as well. So you can see this slide here. We have, again, it's the umbrella term, which illustrates how dementia is this umbrella that's describing the set of symptoms, again, that we see in the individual. So, and also you can see here on the slide some common causes of dementia. So you can see Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal Lewy body disease, vascular dementia, and Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. So here there are 5 listed, but actually in research, we have found over 100 different types of irreversible forms of dementia. So again, Alzheimer's disease is just one type of disease that's causing the symptoms in an individual. So what I'm going to do on this slide here is just go over briefly some of the prominent characteristics that you might see due to these irreversible causes of dementia. So we'll start with Alzheimer's disease. So what you probably think about and what's most initially characteristic for somebody who has Alzheimer's disease is memory loss and forgetfulness. But with Alzheimer's disease, it typically starts with short-term memory loss that we see first symptoms in an individual. Frontotemporal dementia is actually another umbrella term. So this is where it gets a little bit confusing. It's for a group of rare disorders that we'll going to explore in more detail throughout the rest of the presentation. But in general, some symptoms include changes to somebody's communication, their personality, and behavior changes as well. With Lewy body dementia, we often see Parkinson-like symptoms. So the person might have muscle rigidity, tremors, and difficulty with movement. As well, we see cognitive changes, and one hallmark to Lewy body disease is vivid hallucinations. So somebody might hallucinate people or animals. And then vascular dementia. So this is a result of something like a stroke or a TIA or a lack of oxygen to an area in the brain. And this one's a little bit different because we call it a stepwise progression. So let's say if somebody has a stroke tomorrow, we might see a sudden decline in their symptoms, then maybe a stabling off, and then again a sudden decline and a stabling. So it's a little bit of a different progression than the other types of dementia, as it is a step-like progression towards end of life. And really the symptoms depend on which area of the brain is affected. So if somebody's frontal lobe's affected, it'll be a much different symptom than if their occipital lobe, which is the back of the brain, is affected. And lastly, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease is a very rare disease, and it's caused by infectious prions. So one variant of the disease, you might have heard of it before, is mad cow disease. So the symptoms of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease are very similar to Alzheimer's. However, its progression is a lot more rapid. So typically somebody will pass away within 2 years of being diagnosed with Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. So really what I wanted to give you here is just an idea that dementia, again, is this umbrella term that we're seeing, and there are many different causes to the symptoms of dementia. And the person might have slightly different symptoms due to damage within specific areas of the brain. The progression or the stage of the disease that the person's in, and also the individual themselves. So their personality, their life story, their history will all make a difference to how somebody presents in everyday life. So how do they decide how to make a diagnosis for one of these different types of dementia? It can be very tricky, it can be difficult because there's no one single test that is used to diagnose any type of those dementias that we just talked about. So generally, doctors will go through a process of identifying features of each of the diseases and ruling out other causes. So it can involve any or all of the following. So it can look at medical history. So for example, doctors would ask questions about the symptoms that you're experiencing, understand what other past medical conditions you might have, or family history. We can also see the doctor maybe take brain imaging scans. So you might have heard of an MRI scan, or a PET scan, or a CT scan, or a SPET scan. And these are different types of brain images that can show us different structural and neuroimaging changes within the brain. So for example, somebody who has frontotemporal dementia, there'll be changes to the frontal lobe, which is right at the front of the brain, and the temporal lobes, which is at the side of the brain. Cognitive tests. So we see physical and neurological examination done, and this can assess somebody's language, their behavior, their memory, executive and visual functionings. So again, each type of dementia will have slightly different results and different cognitive tests that somebody might have to go through depending on the symptoms and what the doctor is suspecting to be happening. So what's interesting about frontotemporal dementia is that it's often misdiagnosed, unfortunately. It can be diagnosed as depression or as other types of dementia, and it's often confusing for doctors to get to that diagnosis. So I keep talking about frontotemporal dementia, and we're going to go into details about what it is now and what it might look like. So frontotemporal dementia, it's sometimes referred to as FTD, and I might use that today as it's a little bit shorter, but it's also, like I said, an umbrella term for a group of rare disorders that primarily affect the frontal and temporal regions of the brain. And these areas are generally associated with somebody's personality and their behavior. So researchers estimate that approximately 5 to 10% of all people living with dementia have this frontotemporal dementia. So it's not as prominent as something like Alzheimer's disease. However, oftentimes it has a younger onset. So somebody might be 40 or 50 or 60 years old when they're developing frontotemporal dementia. It is more common at this age. And actually, it is the most common type of dementia at a younger age. So somebody who's before the age of 65, what we call young onset. So approximately 20% of the cases are from people with frontotemporal dementia at this young onset age. So again, as I mentioned, FTD is this umbrella term. So in this webinar, I'm going to highlight 3 categories or types of frontotemporal disorders. So the first one is behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia. So this is the most common type of FTD, and you might have also heard of the term Pick's disease, as it used to be called this in the past. It was named after the person who discovered it. So common symptoms of behavioral variant include things like changes to somebody's personality, changes to their behavior and judgment. People with this behavioral variant often exhibit drastic changes to their personality. So somebody might have a lack of empathy towards other people. They might not have understanding of how their comments affect those around them, or they might not consider the feelings of other people as well. The next disorder is primary progressive aphasia. So this involves changes in one's ability to communicate. So somebody could have difficulty with reading or understanding what other people are asking. They could have difficulty with expressing themselves verbally through speaking or writing. So sometimes people might have word finding difficulty or recognizing the meaning of words or producing speech or understanding others as well. So there are 3 types of primary progressive aphasia, and how they are determined is by the language problems that are seen at first. So the 3 types are semantic. So in semantic type, the person loses the ability to understand single words or recognize faces of familiar people or common objects. So they have difficulty with the meaning of the word. Then we have agrammatic is the second one, which also sometimes is called progressive non-fluent aphasia. So the person would have trouble with producing speech or potentially also become non-verbal. And the last one is lopogenic. And this one is having trouble finding the right words for things, but the person can understand conversations and they don't have any problems with grammar. So you can see each of these types can affect a person's communication a little bit differently, but can also look similar at times as well. And the third type is movement disorders that are associated with frontotemporal dementia. So there are 2 neurological disorders that affect the area within the brain that control movement, but they can also affect thinking and language abilities as well. So they are cortical basal degeneration and what we call progressive supranuclear palsy. So cortical basal degeneration causes progressive loss of ability to control movement and most commonly starts in the use of hands or arms despite normal strength in the individual. Progressive supranuclear palsy causes problems with balance and walking, and the hallmark sign is trouble with eye movements and particularly with looking down. So along with those 2, we can also see other movement disorders that are associated with frontotemporal disorders. And those things can be frontotemporal dementia with Parkinsonism, and then also frontotemporal dementia with ALS, which is also referred to as motor neuron disease. So motor neuron disease is a combination of behavioral variant, FTD, which we can see on the screen here, and ALS. So it's a combination of those 2 working together. And the symptoms can include both behavioral and or language changes, as well as progressive muscle weakness, which is seen in ALS. So what causes frontotemporal dementia? Unfortunately, we don't really know. There's little known about the cause of it. There has been really no real risk factors that have been yet identified. Most cases are not inherited. However, having a genetic link can be what we call a risk factor. So for example, if somebody in your direct bloodline has frontotemporal dementia, you might be at a higher risk for developing it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you will go on in life to develop it. There is, however, one extremely rare type of frontotemporal dementia, which can be passed on from generation to generation, and this is called familial frontotemporal dementia. So like I said, we don't know exactly how somebody is, what causes frontotemporal dementia in somebody, but what we do know is what happens within somebody's brain when they develop it. So there are many important proteins that are needed for normal brain functioning. However, sometimes when there's a buildup of certain proteins, they can become toxic to the brain. So there are three main proteins that cause frontotemporal dementia. So they're tau protein, which makes up about 45 to 50% of people with FTD. There's also this TDP43 protein that can cause an excess buildup, and this FUS protein. So this is more rare, but it's more common in those who have ALS. So around 5% of people with FTD have this FUS protein buildup. Also, what's not on the screen here, but we can see people potentially have beta or amyloid pathology, which is the same pathology that we see in Alzheimer's disease. So there can still be behavior variance, and somebody can still have Alzheimer's disease pathology, but the frontotemporal symptoms. So what happens in general? These proteins start to change the neuron structure or the cell structure within the brain, and they cause the neuron to die, and they lead to the changes or symptoms that we see in the individual. So now that we have an understanding of the different types of frontotemporal dementia, let's now discover what are some of the common signs and symptoms for those who might be exhibiting one of those different types. So we're just going to talk in general about some of the symptoms that we might see somebody exhibit. And there are three domains. So the first one is changes to somebody's behavior. The second one is changes to communication. And the third one is problems with movement. So just something to note, depending on the type of FTD, again, the progression or the stage that somebody's at, the individual or the person might experience some or all of the symptoms. And the symptoms can also change, again, throughout the progression. So as the person continues to progress in the disease, we might see more and more symptoms become prevalent. And some other interesting highlights just to note, unlike other types of dementia, such as Alzheimer's disease, memory is actually typically not a concern for somebody who has FTD. The person often retains their short-term and their long-term memory for a long period of time, and they can be very conscious of the time, the year, the date, etc. However, in the early stages of FTD, the symptoms can appear separately. So for example, somebody can have changes to behavior, but they have no changes to communication. Or someone might have very specific difficulties with communication, but have no behavior changes. Again, as the disease progresses, the symptoms can start to overlap. So what are some symptoms? So first, let's talk about behavior changes. So the person can become withdrawn or disinhibited in their behavior. So for example, they might lose the ability to restrain their actions. So they can swear at inappropriate times. Maybe they say something embarrassing or rude, or comments to other people. So for example, they might point out that somebody's fat, or maybe they make sexual suggestions towards other people. They might also lose interest in personal hygiene. So they maybe don't want to shower, they don't want to change their clothes or care as much about brushing their teeth or smelling good. They can be easily distracted. So maybe they divert their attention from a conversation to something else that's happening. Maybe they have a shorter attention span for an activity of maybe 1 to 2 minutes. They might also repeat the same activities continuously. So for example, I used to work in the day program, like I had mentioned, and I worked with one gentleman who had frontotemporal dementia, and he would become very fixated on things. And one thing that he was very fixated on was moving a pen on the table. So he always wanted it to be in a certain spot. So he would sometimes spend hours moving the pen to be able to get it into an area that he felt comfortable with. Sometimes we see somebody overeating or having unusual desire to put foreign objects in their mouth. We can see sometimes people having incontinence or inability to wait to go to the washroom or the toilet. We can see blunted emotions. So maybe the person seems like they don't care or they don't respond as they normally would. We can also see a decrease in the person's energy or motivation. So maybe they're not interested in the past hobbies that they had or activities that they had. We can also see changes in somebody's personality. Maybe somebody was quiet and they weren't extroverted, but now they go to talk to people on the street, or they say whatever they want, etc. Or it could be vice versa. Apathy. So this is a big one that we see people exhibiting. So apathy is described as the loss of motivation. So it's when a person has difficulty initiating activity. So they might be able to do something, but they can't get started on their own. For example, you bring food to somebody and you set it out to them and you ask them to eat. You come back 10 minutes later and you notice they haven't done anything and the food is untouched. So, however, when you start the movement of bringing the fork to that individual's mouth, they're able to do it on their own, but they just can't initiate or start that activity as they used to be able to. And we can also see an increase in sexual desire, or again, making sexual suggestions at inappropriate times. So what are some changes to communication that we might expect? So maybe the person is now speaking less, or having difficulty with finding words for things, or difficulty describing things, or using proper sentences. Putting sentences in the proper order might become difficult for somebody. Somebody might in a conversation repeat back constantly what other people are saying, or they might stutter in a conversation. They might also have difficulty sustaining a train of thought or maintaining a conversation, or difficulties with reading or writing. And the person also could have difficulty recalling or understanding word meanings, but maybe they have no problem with normal speech. Or near the end of life stages, we might see somebody with total loss of speech. So what are some problems that can occur with movement? So we might see decreased facial expressions, we can see slowness of movements, rigidity or postural instability, we can see frequent falling, swallowing difficulties or poor coordination, or at the end of life, maybe total need or support for those to help with movement. All right, so now we've described some of the symptoms that we might see in somebody, but how does that connect with ALS? So it's only been very recently recognized that frontotemporal dementia and ALS can go together. So somebody can have the symptoms of behavior variant frontotemporal dementia, like behavior changes, communication changes, as well as have a diagnosis of ALS for progressive muscle weakness. So one study found that 40% of cases of those who had frontotemporal dementia diagnosed have also measurable motor dysfunction, and up to 15% of them match criteria for ALS. And they also did studies on people who were already diagnosed with ALS, and they found that 52% of these patients met criteria for frontotemporal dementia syndrome, or at least had some significant behavioral or cognitive deficits as well. So it's been identified that ALS is most commonly associated with behavioral variant frontotemporal dementia. So in some people, the ALS symptoms come first, or in other people, the frontotemporal dementia symptoms come first, and then the symptoms of motor dysfunction come later. And we don't know right now why one happens before the other. Another study here that I have just information on, so the incidence of FTD in patients with bulbar onset ALS have been reported as high as 48%. So bulbar onset is the first symptoms appearing of ALS in swallowing or speech problems. And what's also interesting is this frontotemporal dementia symptoms that we see of the behavioral variant and the symptoms that we see with ALS have overlapping genetics as well as neuropathology as well. So what does that all mean? It means that people who are living with frontotemporal dementia might also be at risk of having some symptoms of ALS. And it also means that those who are living with ALS currently can also potentially experience other cognitive deficits or changes to behavior or to communication as well. So as a caregiver or somebody who's living with either of these, either and or both, it's really important to consider how this can affect the person in their everyday living and how it's going to affect relationships or interactions or future care. So what are some implications to daily living with one of these diagnoses? So some things to consider. So driving issues. So driving can become very unsafe for somebody. So for example, if there's a decline in the person's judgment or decision-making or predicting consequences and handling multiple details of entering the brain, it can impair driver's skills. So there can be signs where we might think that a comprehensive driver test might indicate stopping driving altogether. So for example, if the person's having trouble with parking, if there's any confusion about operating the vehicle, how to stop it or start it or park it or shift the gears. If they have trouble noticing other cars around them or pedestrians on either side of the road, you'd want to check that out. Any near misses, such as almost hitting another car or changing lanes inappropriately. Any side swiping of other individuals, or any accidents, including small fender benders or big accidents. So thinking about how we might consider driving cessation at this time. Daily responsibilities. So there can be a decline in functioning, right? And this can disrupt the person's family life, especially if the person is younger. Remember, we mentioned that a lot of people are 40 or 50 years old, and they might have demanding responsibilities in their everyday life, right? So they could be supporting a family, or maybe be a full-time homemaker, or caring for children or grandchildren. Maybe they're a community leader or head of an organization. So it can often change somebody's dynamic in daily living. Financial matters. So a lot of people with frontotemporal dementia, the behavioral variant, again, they lose judgment or insight. So they can be vulnerable to scams. So they might start spending large amount of money on worthless products, or they give away large amount of money to telemarketers potentially. So the family caregivers and the person might need to think about how they can plan ahead to secure finances. So bank accounts, credit cards, investments, etc. A family attorney who specializes in elder law, or an accountant or financial planner, can be really helpful in these matters. And then also planning ahead for care. So if the person is declining in their judgment, they might limit thinking about the consequences of making choices, and they might decrease their sensitivity about appropriate timing or limits. So it's really important to team up and work together to help support that individual. So the caregiver might decrease or restrict responsibilities, including maybe the person paying bills, handling all the mail, using machinery, caring for other people, especially children maybe. You might need to have extra support there. Doing complicated multi-step tasks alone might be difficult for the individual. So it's really important to think about personal care and changes to responsibility over time. And this is really where it's really important to ask for help and to seek those services and supports, to think about how can we plan ahead, how can we have this future, and how can we be supported, and having respite and a good sense of humor is always really helpful as well. So before we move on and we talk about some tips for caregiving, I just want to ask about some of your experiences in caregiving right now, or in general, if you're living with any of these types of diagnosis. What are some strategies that you've used among the years to help support the person that have been successful for you, that you're who you're caring for? So if you want to just add it to the chat box, I can take a look here. If you have any strategies that you found successful when supporting the person you're currently caring for. Oh yeah, humor. I'm seeing humor. That's wonderful. Yeah, I think that's so important, definitely. Keeping a few items on hand that I know the person likes and can be directed to. Yes, definitely. Having this idea of what is meaningful to that person so I can use that, especially if they have repetitive type behavior and they like to do the same thing over and over again. Having those key things that you know they like to do is really helpful. Setting up routines. Yeah, routines are so important. For any type of dementia, I really encourage people to use routines, as it can be helpful for just easing with navigation of daily living. Try not to agitate the person. Yeah, I think this is really important. And we have a saying at the Alzheimer Society that we say, connect, don't correct. So instead of trying to correct the person and tell them your reality, trying to meet them in their reality and have a moment of connection rather than a moment of fighting or agitation potentially. Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody, for sharing. You can keep adding those in there, but I will continue on. So what are some of the tips that we have that might help to support the person living with ALS or FTD, cognitive changes, etc.? So thinking about the person's basic needs. So finding out, are they in pain? Looking for signs of pain. And also meeting their basic needs. So for toileting, appropriate diet, and food intake, etc. So trying to meet those basic needs are super important. Establishing and maintaining a routine or a daily schedule, as somebody has mentioned, it can be very helpful, and it can allow the person to learn and anticipate what will be happening next. So what's interesting is oftentimes people say that somebody with dementia can no longer learn new things. However, people can still continue to learn through routine, even if they're experiencing some form of memory loss. Talking in concrete terms and avoid using sarcasm or figures of speech. So remembering that if the person is lacking empathy or having difficulty understanding what others are saying, they might take what you say very literally. So using sarcasm or figures of speech might be difficult for that person to understand. Reducing external distractions when talking or doing activities. So this one to me is very important, because somebody with frontotemporal dementia can easily be distracted. So they might have difficulty sustaining their attention on one thing at a time. So if there's things going on in the environment, it's very loud, there's TV blaring, there's lots of different activities going on, it can be very difficult for that individual to concentrate. So as much as possible, having a one-on-one interaction when you need to do an activity or have a conversation in a quiet space where the task is matching the person's capabilities. So we always want to think about what is the person's current capabilities and how can I help support those capabilities in the moment. Trying not to rush the person. So it might take the person longer to do tasks or activities. So as much as possible, using patience and giving and planning for extra time for activities. This is one here that you had sort of mentioned, don't argue, reason, correct, or insist on being right. So I think this one is often very tricky, but this one for me is the most important. Remember that if somebody has damage to different areas within the brain, they can potentially have difficulty with judgment or insight. So what their brain is telling them to be true might be true to them, even if it's not necessarily correct in our current reality. So we maybe know that what they're arguing is not correct. However, their brain is telling them that that is correct. So instead of trying to argue with that individual, it's really about connecting with that individual. So again, taking that moment to connect rather than correct. How can you meet them in their reality? It's not about lying to the person. It's about validating their reality to help them express themselves. So there's a whole type of therapy that's called validation therapy, which I find very interesting. And it's mostly for people who have Alzheimer's disease, but it can work for anybody with any form of dementia or difficulty with cognitive insight. So it's just meeting that person in their reality to help them express themselves. So if you're interested, look up validation therapy on Google by Naomi Feil, and she's a really great social worker out of the United States who developed that type of therapy. Prompt and encourage the person to do an activity. So especially if the person's experiencing apathy, maybe they're not able to initiate an activity on their own, we might need to use prompts or what we call cues to help the person initiate that activity on their own. So for example, they could be a visual cue, so you could use a cue card, a picture, a word of what you want the person to do. It could be an auditory cue, so you say something that you want the person to do, or a physical cue. So for example, you want someone to stand up, you touch them on the arm and the leg and you guide them and you say, let's stand up now. You might also start an activity for the person. So remember that we were talking about that example of somebody not eating. And it's not because the person maybe can't do that anymore, but maybe they can't initiate the activity of bringing the fork to their mouth. So maybe you use the hand over hand approach, you put your hand on top of their hand, you start the movement of that activity, and then you allow the person to do it on their own. Mirroring activity or demonstrating what you want the person to do. So this idea is about showing the person what you want them to do. For example, if you want someone to do the dishes, maybe you can do the dishes alongside of them at first. Instead of just telling them how to do it, you show them what you want to do, and then they might be able to do it on their own. And it's really a supportive way of asking for a task to be done. And then for compulsive or repetitive behaviors where somebody's doing something over and over again, try to turn that into something useful. So for example, if someone really wants to do something over and over, get them to fold the laundry over and over again, or sort cards, or sort buttons. Or I used to have something I used to do in the day program where we'd get somebody to put washers onto onto a screw. So screwing on washers, and that could take their attention for hours. Or I had a gentleman who had frontotemporal dementia, and he used to be a mailman, and we would get him to stuff envelopes, and he would spend hours doing that, and it brought him a lot of enjoyment. So I think somebody's idea there about knowing what that person likes and directing them to that activity can be very helpful, especially in times where the person might be upset or agitated, etc. And then when you can, try to limit choices. So sometimes if you ask like an open-ended question, it can be very difficult for the person to come up with a response. So try more closed-ended questions, unless the open-ended question works. So maybe, for example, what do you want for lunch? There's 100 different answers to that, so giving choice. Would you like chicken or rice? Might be a little bit easier for somebody to formulate a response. So this is the acronym that I like to leave you with when you're thinking about providing care to somebody. It's the KISS acronym. So we say keep it sweet, so trying to be positive as much as possible. Keep it the same, so having routine. Keep it simple, so thinking about what are the priorities that you might have. So prioritizing what is most important and what is preferred to be done in the day. Keeping the activities short, so having short activities, short explanations, maybe shorter conversations or briefer conversations can be a lot more positive and have a positive response. And safe, so make sure we're reducing risk, making sure that everybody is safe in the scenario. So that is it for the portion of the frontotemporal and ALS. But I will go into now some of the services that we have at the Alzheimer Society. So we support anybody living with any form of dementia. So we support people with frontotemporal, Lewy body, ALS if you have those symptoms, but you're noticing cognitive changes and you want to speak to somebody, we are there for you and we would love to help support you. So we are a nonprofit organization, so everything that we do is free of charge. So we have counseling services, so we have social workers who are available over the phone, who can talk to people about stress reduction, knowledge and skills for both the person with dementia and their families. They can talk about getting a diagnosis, community support services, communication strategies, how to understand somebody's behavior and how to support it. We also have support groups. So these are for people who are supporting somebody with dementia. For example, we used to have a support group of those who were supporting somebody with frontotemporal dementia. And that was in a separate group, as there's different considerations than somebody who might be supporting somebody with another form of dementia. And they can talk, they get together, they share their experiences, they learn from one another, they often make friendships, and it's a really great safe space. And then we also have care navigation. So we have care navigators who are available to speak to the people, to anybody who has a diagnosis of dementia. They want to find services that are out there for them. We can help connect them to those services. We also have education, training, and information. So we have a lot of different workshops on Alzheimer's disease, other types of dementia, communication tips, behavior changes, and what to expect. We have workshops online that you can take at any time if you're interested. We have information packages that we can send to you if you would like to have any information about anything that we talked about today that you want to know more about. We have active living programs. So this is for people living with any form of dementia and their care partners within the Toronto region. So typically we would have in-person activities, but right now they're all via Zoom. So for example, we have weekly respite groups where people get together, they do activities, and their care partner can sort of have their own respite and do something for themselves for 1 hour. Or we have music therapy programs, we have exercise classes, we have non-impact aerobic classes that we do weekly. We have programs like date night, where somebody with dementia and their care partner get together with other couples, and the focus is not on dementia at all. It's about having a good time, eating dinner, singing with each other, dancing, etc. Of course, it's not in person right now, but we're doing Zoom formats of those. And the Medic Alert Safely Home program. So this is a nationwide program, and it's designed to help identify a person who is out in the community and is maybe lost and cannot find their way back home. So if you ever see somebody who's out in the community and they have this medical alert bracelet on and it's blue in color, it means the person has memory loss. So if you flip it around and you can see this picture here on the back, you'll see a number to call and you'll see what the diagnosis the person has, and it'll give the person's name, etc. And then it'll give you an ID number to give to that number when you give them a call. So you can register for that if you're interested by phone, online, or mail, and the phone number is there, and it's a Medical Alert Safely Home program. This program here, the Finding Your Way program, it is designed to raise awareness, again, about the risk of people with dementia going lost, to help prevent the missing incidents, and support the safe return of those who do go missing. So 6 out of 10 people who are living with some form of dementia will go missing at least once. And of those people, if they're not found within 24 hours, half of them will either be seriously injured or pass away. So it is a huge risk for the person, for their family. So this website is a really, really great resource for families, for the person to go on to look at how can we keep that person safe living in the community. And it has online modules where people can watch videos. It has lots of different resources, things to read, and it's available in 12 different languages. One of my favorite programs that we have is this music project. So we provide personalized music for people living with dementia. So anybody with mild cognitive impairment, dementia, any sort of diagnosis can apply for this. So what it is you get a free personalized music player uploaded with music that is specific to that individual. So there's so many benefits to personalized music, and we've seen so many documentaries, so many studies done about the power of music. So somebody might not be able to speak anymore, but they put on their favorite music and they can sing and they can dance, and it's just wonderful. So we can see increased communication, physical activity, social activity, can improve somebody's mood or sleep, reignite older memories, and increase overall quality of life. And what's interesting is that music is beneficial in all stages of dementia. So even near the end of life stages, it is still very beneficial. And again, it has to be personalized. So we can't put the same music on for everybody. It has to be what's unique to that person. So if you're interested in this program and you think it might apply to you, you can always apply online at themusicproject.ca, or you can give us a call to see if you might be eligible, or if you know somebody and you want to know more information about it. Okay. So I have this evaluation, but maybe what I will do is I'll send it out. And if you're interested in filling out the evaluation, I would love to hear. This is my first time doing a presentation like this. And if you have any feedback, comments about the presentation, I would love to hear it. But that is it for me for now. So thank you so much. And I would be happy to answer any questions if there are any at this time.
Thank you, Nicole. We do have a few questions, actually. The question we have is, when my loved one does something inappropriate in public, what do I do?
That's a great question. Yeah, so I think that it really depends, right, on your comfort level. So you can think about, how would you want somebody else to respond if that happened? So for example, if you saw somebody else doing something inappropriate in public, how would you want other people around that person to respond? So you can first think about that. Something that we do often recommend that people do or consider. So we have little cards that we give people that says, the person I'm with is living with frontotemporal dementia, or the person I'm with is living with Alzheimer's disease, for example. Please do not mind their behavior, etc. So sometimes if you're feeling really uncomfortable, the person that you're with is doing things that you wouldn't really want them to do to others, and you want people to understand, you can just subtly hand them this and say, I'm sorry, or whatever it is that you want to say. You hand them this card and you say, this is maybe what's happening. And people are often right away easy to empathize and can really understand why that might be happening.
Thank you. One of the questions is, Zoom calls with multiple people might not be best. How long is a good one-on-one Zoom call? How long should you expect to be able to keep someone's attention on a one-on-one call?
Again, that really comes down to the person. So first, you would want to think about what are the person's capabilities in this moment. So in general, what is their attention span? Is it 5 minutes? Is it 10 minutes? Is it an hour? If they're having a Zoom call and an hour just seems too much, then we would want to limit it. Maybe we would start with a shorter period of time, see how that goes. And again, it's going to change each day, unfortunately. So sometimes, like everybody, right? Sometimes we have a good day, sometimes we have a bad day. So just asking the person, gauging what you think their attention span is on that day, and then going from there, I would suggest.
Do you have any tips for patients who do not see or who deny they have dementia?
That's a great question. So one thing that we find, sometimes people have what we call anosognosia. So that's a fancy word, but basically what it means is the person doesn't know that they don't know. So they might not be aware at all of the changes that are happening to them. So they maybe don't realize that their memory is changing or their judgment is changing, or they can also lack insight into understanding the disease process or understanding the symptoms in themselves. So this is a really tricky one, I would say. But my best suggestion is, because again, it differs on the person. So we have this idea of person-centered care. What works for one person might not work for another person. So I would really encourage you to talk to a social worker. So for example, we have social workers who can kind of give you tips and tricks to help work with that person, to maybe get them to the doctor or to be able to speak about it a little more in depth. So I would suggest a social worker would probably be the best option there.
So this question kind of stems off the same point, but for a person who doesn't want to leave the couch all day, how do I motivate them? Or is it okay if I just leave them be?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So again, it comes down to the person and their personality, their capabilities. So if the person is experiencing apathy, again, remember that apathy is the loss of ability to initiate. So it might be that they look like they're sitting on the couch and they don't seem interested in anything. But when you actually go up to them, you ask them or you show them an activity, they actually really want to do it, right? They really are feeling like, oh, I actually want to do this, but I can't initiate it on my own. And that's due to damage within the brain. So you might want to decide, is it due to apathy? Because then we would want to engage the person, right? We would want to see what they want to do and what they might be interested in. Or potentially, is it due to something else? Is it due to depression? Because oftentimes we can see people who start to exhibit these things have something like symptoms of depression. Maybe they just don't feel motivated to do anything. They feel this lack of maybe they feel sort of helplessness potentially. In that case, we would also want to see, is it depression that might be causing the symptoms in the person? And then that would be a different route that we would go to seek support for that person in terms of depression. Or is it just their personality at this stage? Has the damage within their brain started to change that individual's personality, and maybe now they no longer want to do the activities that they used to enjoy, and we maybe need to find a different activity that they might enjoy? Or maybe it's just that we leave them for that day and then the next day we reapproach them in a different way.
Sounds like what you're saying all along is that it's very personal, and what today may not work tomorrow, and what works this hour may not work in the next hour.
Yes, exactly.
I think we have just one more question, but the last question is, if someone suspects an FTD diagnosis, either from what they've learned on what they've read online, what they've heard in other groups, what they've learned today, What's their best avenue to seek out some type of diagnosis?
So really any doctor can do a diagnosis, but I would recommend, and I'm sure most people would recommend, a specialist. So you can start by going to your doctor, your general practitioner, your family doctor. And I always suggest when people do that, write down what you're noticing, because we often get to the doctor and we say, I think I have some cognitive changes and I'm worried about frontotemporal dementia. And the doctor will say, okay, why? And then maybe we can't come up with all the reasons at that time. So writing down everything that you're noticing in the person or in yourself. And then again, the doctor will start and say, okay, this is what I'm thinking. Maybe we'll go through an assessment, a cognitive assessment. And then you can also advocate for yourself. So I always encourage advocating and saying, hey, I'm really worried about this. I would like to see a specialist. And you can see a geriatric specialist. A really great organization would be like Toronto Memory Program. They do free dementia screening. So if you want to go to somewhere like that, that could be something good. We don't endorse any, sorry, the Alzheimer Society doesn't endorse any one place specifically. I just know of that place personally, and I know they do dementia screening regularly. So there's lots of ways you can go about it, but just going to the doctor, advocating for yourself and saying, I'm really worried about these things. This is why, again, writing down those concrete examples and then seeing what they say about it.
Eventually, we have a lot of really good resources. So I think if someone's looking, a really simple Google search will point them in the right direction. So if you don't live in the Toronto area and you want to get connected with the Alzheimer Society, there is I don't even know how many, but there is a lot of them across the province. Each one can be reached out to separately. And they all do very similar but very unique things depending on, the location of that place, how many people they're supporting. We've been lucky to connect with you guys because we have a great connection in Toronto, and we're just so fortunate. So we thank you so much, Nicole, for today. So as a follow-up to this, we will send out the link to your SurveyMonkey. And then we also allow people to keep asking questions, because if you're not sure, ask them. And if something struck you after the fact, we'll follow up with Nicole and her team about making sure you have the right connections. And if it's just trying to figure out in your area who to connect with, we'll make sure that happens. So please reach out to us. Nicole, do you have any final thoughts before we end?
I just want to say thank you so much. And you summarized that beautifully. Like you said, there's Alzheimer societies all across Canada, Ontario, and we can be there to help support you. So if you do need any support and you want to reach out to us, we are here, and we are happy to help support you in any way that we can possible. And I just like to say that, even if you have some diagnosis of dementia, it doesn't mean that you change tomorrow, right? There's still lots of great quality of life left to be lived. And I've seen that firsthand in the people that I've worked with. And I know that there's many great people out there who are providing wonderful services. So I really encourage you to seek those services as much as possible, because people often seek them too late. And it's better to seek them early, when it's easier. So when it gets a little bit harder, maybe at the end stages, we already have that support there in place.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who took the time to join us this afternoon. And if you missed any part of this and you're just joining us near the end of it, we will have it recorded, and you can just ask us and we will send you out the link. It is going to be listed on our YouTube channel. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you, Nicole. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.